Okay, thanks everyone. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike Thompson to start our webinar.
All right, hello and welcome. So I hear there are some 400 students and alumni watching today. My name is Michael Thompson. I'm a professor in material science and engineering. Having been at Cornell for 40 years now, I must say that one of the most exciting opportunities as professor is to watch students discover their passion in the world, whether it's in engineering or other pursuits. And today I'm particularly excited to have the opportunity to talk with Naren Shankar, who has definitely pursued his passions, combining an interest in engineering and science with the entertainment industry in Hollywood. Naren came to Cornell in 1979, originally as a student in the arts and sciences, but with broad interest and aptitude in math and science, he switched into engineering and specifically into engineering physics. He received his bachelor's degree in 1984 and couldn't quite stand to leave quite yet, so he continued on with Professor Pollack in electrical and computer engineering for his PhD, studying the subtleties of lasers and optics. He received his PhD in 1990 and then faced the same question that all students face: what am I going to do when I grow up? For Shankar and his diverse interests, that choice was to take a big risk and test his fortunes as a writer in Hollywood. He got his break with Star Trek: The Next Generation as a writer and science consultant, and has been successful in Hollywood ever since. After winning awards for The Outer Limits and Farscape, his science interests led him to one of the most watched and successful shows in history, CSI: Crime Scene Investigators, where he was writer, executive producer, and co-showrunner for almost 10 years. He is currently the executive producer and showrunner on the acclaimed series The Expanse on Amazon Prime, as well as a writer and executive producer on the show For All Mankind on Apple TV. Of course, he continues to receive acclaim for his work, including a Hugo Award for The Expanse in 2017. I'd like to welcome Naren Shankar to our segment on I Am a Cornell Engineer. Welcome.
Hello, happy to be here.
So Naren, let me start. You have a lot of history with Cornell. Bad memories fortunately fade over time, while the good ones grow and are cherished. What really stands out, good and bad, about your time at Cornell as you think back?
I actually loved my time at Cornell. I mean, one of the reasons I stayed on undergraduate to graduate, because I just loved Ithaca so much. It was a great place to learn. It was a beautiful campus. I was a member of the Kappa Alpha Literary Society, which is no longer, unfortunately, a fraternity there. Met some really, really good people. And it was really one of the, I think, an incredibly joyful experience for me, 10 years.
For 10 years. So we have to ask, what do you remember kind of as your best classes, perhaps because it influenced you or because it taught you the most? And equally, and maybe even the same question, what faculty do you remember as exceptional and how they influenced you?
It's an odd question in some ways, because I'm sorry, it's an odd answer in some ways, because as you said, I started as an art student and I transferred into engineering. And as I was working on my doctorate, I started gravitating back towards the arts college. I mean, Cornell doesn't do minors, but if they did, I probably would have minored in history. And so what ended up happening was I had some great professors on the engineering side and some great professors in the arts side. Probably my favorite professor on the arts side was Walter Lefebvre, who was a professor of history, taught an amazing course called History of American Foreign Policy over a full year. It was absolutely one of the highlights, I think, of my time at Cornell. You know, there's a lot of great professors in the engineering college. I mean, Cliff was a great professor, boy, I'd have to really go back through my memory bank for that one. I was actually just cleaning out my garage the other day, and I came across some old notebooks I had from TNAM 610, and I went back, and I was like, I don't think I can do any of this anymore.
I do remember complex analysis. That was a great course.
It was.
So that's very good. So I think the other is campus has changed a lot, but it's always kind of fun thinking what life was like. So as you think back, certainly Clark Hall and Phillips have been some of the ones that have changed the most. But what do you remember of your time and the locations on campus? Where you might study, where you would hide?
I loved the 80 White Library in Uris. That was my favorite place to study. That was a beautiful room. I spent a lot of time there. Carpenter was a little grim for my taste. It was yeah, you could get kind of lost down there. You know, I actually loved. You couldn't really spend too much time there. I loved Myron Taylor. There's a beautiful library there. Yeah, I mean, I spent probably most of my time in Uris though.
In libraries. All right, so I don't spend a lot because you've had just an incredible career. So let's go back to that. You took what I would consider to be a huge risk at graduation, heading out to Hollywood and trying your hand. Tell us the story. What went through your mind, and how did it evolve?
That was a story about, really, I think mostly about the power of ignorance, and it was. I didn't really have, you know, a huge game plan. I started Cornell when I was very young. I skipped a couple of grades, so I just turned 16 when I started in 1980, and I was 25, I guess, when I got my PhD. And I had, you know, I felt like I had a couple of years to burn. And so I had some friends that I had gone to school with in the Kappa Alpha Literary Society who had left and were breaking into Hollywood. And when I got my doctorate, the job market wasn't great. And we kind of came out, and my friend said, you know, you should come out to Hollywood and be a writer. And I was like, that sounds amazing. and that was just based on simply just loving television and movies and just doing writing for fun while I was at Cornell. And so I literally just threw a few suitcases in my car and drove out to LA. And that, one of my friends was, still is, Ron Moore, who created Battlestar Galactica, and he was just breaking in the industry, and he started on Star Trek. And through him, I was able to get a script in front of the right people, and that got me an internship with the Writers Guild of America. And that led to becoming a science consultant because Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, wanted the show to have more of a scientific basis. And because of my background, that got my foot in the door. And that ultimately led to writing assignments and staying around. And then about a year and a half later, I ended up getting, you know, offered a staff position on the show. And that was how it all started. I got very, very lucky. But it was, if I'd known the odds going into it, I probably wouldn't have done it. and especially, I'm first generation Indian. I was born in India, but grew up in the States and Canada. And, you know, for my family and for everybody that my parents knew, it was always like, you know, you got to get an education, doctor, lawyer, engineer, businessman. Those are the professions. There was no reference point for Hollywood. There was the idea that you could get a job as a writer was just, you know, insane. That's not possible.
So I want to follow up. I mean, one of the ones that we talk about a lot is the opportunity to just connect, I don't want to say connections, but the networks that you build of people that you know at Cornell. You've had a long career with Ronald Moore. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can comment on how that has influenced and how you've been able to work with him over the years. I know even now your most recent show, For All Mankind, is
yeah. That was again, it's just, you know, we were best buds when we were in college, and he's the one who really sort of encouraged me to come out, you know, really kind of mentored me into the business. He was 2 years behind me at Cornell, but he left to go to Hollywood earlier, and I was finishing up graduate school. So, but yeah, he's been, you know, it's great working with people that you know and you have a long relationship with. We hadn't worked together on a show for some time. For All Mankind, I was there for the first season of it. Just incredible fun, very easy to get back in, into a working relationship with somebody you've known for such a long time. That's always a joyful thing to do.
Yeah, sure. All right, so yeah, you kind of, many of us came to know you through Star Trek: The Next Generation. Now, how did that participation in that show kind of influence and control or influence your career trajectory and later opportunities?
I'm sorry, you just glitched out there just for a moment. Could you repeat that? Sorry.
So I was saying that many of us came to know you through Star Trek: The Next Generation. How did your participation in that show then influence your career trajectory and later opportunities in Hollywood?
Next Generation was kind of a unique thing. It was, it was the first sequel to the original series. Came out with a big splash. It was a very successful show, but after that show ended, and the subsequent series, Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and all that stuff was happening, in the years afterwards. The way it was perceived in the industry was that science fiction was a little bit of a ghetto. It was a very particular kind of a thing, and agents at the time, if you had like a sample script or something that you'd written for Star Trek, they wouldn't even want to read it in the business because it was considered to be, oh, that's just that weird science fiction show. It's like it doesn't really have anything to do with cop shows or doctor shows or sort of the classics. And what's happened over the years is an appreciation for the fact that it's not so much that science fiction is like a subset. It's more of a superset, because within the context of a science fiction show, you can tell a medical drama or a legal drama or a police procedural, and so people have come to appreciate it. And by the time I actually got off of or while I was on CSI, for example, by that time, the perception in the business had actually changed to the point where they're saying, you know what, we need one of those guys from Star Trek because they really understand story and structure. And so there was an appreciation for it. And now we're at a point in the business where, genre tends to dominate almost across the board on the feature side, largely on television as well. So, it's kind of come around in a way that I find quite satisfying.
That's good. So, I mean, is looking through your resume and such, one of the things that struck me as very exciting as well are some of the people that you've gotten to work with. Mm-hmm. I noted in particular that you had the opportunity to work with Harlan Ellison, who is one of the great writers. Yeah. What's it like working with a man like that?
Well, Harlan was famous. He passed away just a couple of years ago, but he was famously cantankerous. I mean, like he was litigious. He would sue people at the drop of the hat. He was it was a firebrand. And there are horror stories of the business of him just being like incredibly mean to the suits, the business side executives. And so when I was on the Outer Limits, we had optioned a story that he had written in the 70s, a beautiful story called The Human Operators. And we were going to turn it into, a 1 hour anthology episode for the Outer Limits. And I loved the story, and I got the assignment to do it. And I got on the phone with him for the first time, and literally I was terrified. And the first words out of my mouth were practically like, Mr. Ellison, I just want to say, at the end of the day, I hope there's way more of your words on the page than mine. I said something like that. And there was like silence at the other end. And then finally he goes, kid, you and I are going to get along great. And after that, the collaboration was, I wrote a draft, and he actually, he would give notes, and he would say like, you're being a little too faithful to the material. Here's, how I think we can change it for the better. And what it really was I think he just needed, it was simply a matter of respect to acknowledge the originator of the material, the source material. And I think that was something that, we got the relationship off to the right, on the right foot. And it was one of the highlights, I think, of my career working with him, because he's a brilliant writer and essayist.
All right, so after that, you pivoted in some ways, or I think you pivoted in the genre at least, from Star Trek and Farscape, Outer Limits, to CSI, crime scene investigations. But as you've commented, it kind of gave you an opportunity to go back to more rigorous science and build it into with the storytelling.
Yeah, I mean,
about that.
part of that was the fact that, and it was a recognition that, you know, again, science fiction was considered such a niche specialty, so that if you were only perceived as being able to do science fiction, you would never be able to work in other areas beyond that. So I made a conscious effort after Farscape to move into other areas, just for the fun of being, you know, just for the fun of writing different things, because you didn't want to necessarily just kind of pigeonhole yourself so you know, precisely. And so I started doing cop shows, and I ended up on CSI. And what was funny about CSI was, unlike, you know, I mean, my position on Star Trek was a science consultant, but that really wasn't about actual science. It was, a friend of mine, as a great little quote, he goes, "Science fiction is bullshit with a thin metal coating." Now, that what I thought was actually pretty funny, because that kind of summed up Star Trek. It was, in some ways, it was just throwing jargon into it. And it was much more about keeping, like, sort of the fake science of Star Trek consistent episode to episode. CSI, weirdly enough, actually had scientific underpinnings. I mean, forensics and criminalistics is kind of ad hoc. It's very sort of, it's more, I would say, in many ways, artistry than science, especially certain specialties in it. Apart from, you know, sort of the gold standard evidentiary elements like DNA analysis, DNA and fingerprint analysis, which are really, really good. But that show actually did use, like, real scientific instruments. In our laboratory set on stage were actual instruments that we actually could use and turn on and do things with. So it was funny that show actually had weirdly more science in it than the science fiction shows that I had worked on. Now that's also changing. Like, The Expanse has got strong scientific underpinnings. For All Mankind is extremely rigorous in its recreation of NASA. In the 60s and 70s. I mean, we had people coming in who were actual mission control operators from the era who just thought that the set was incredible. I mean, it's meticulously designed. So, you know, but yeah, it was a conscious effort to kind of go into different genres for me that got me out of the science fiction, and then came back to science fiction later on.
How did your engineering and science background, did you find yourself using and drawing back on all those memories of classes?
Not so much classes specifically, although I do get to win a lot of arguments about science, generally in the room. Although on The Expanse, we've got some people who are very, very smart and who've done a lot of studying. So the, you know, my win to loss ratio there is a little closer to 50-50, I think. In terms of the coursework, not so much coursework, but one thing that was kind of interesting in terms of, you know, applying the education to a completely different field like writing is, weirdly enough, is peer review. And I will talk about that with writers' rooms actually to this day, which is this idea that, you know, you write a paper, then you sit back with your colleagues and then try to shred it and tear it down to its hypotheses and really analyze it. Writing and rewriting is a lot like that. Is when you write a script and you break a story, if you have the ability as a writer to step back and with the rest of your staff really try to see if the material holds up. Is it internally consistent? Is it psychologically consistent? Is it like, it's the same kind of process. And so the ability to actually kind of take off your hat as a writer and step back and become a member of the audience is incredibly valuable. And that's something that all writers do in every writer's room if that process is going well.
That's great. So your current project, The Expanse, again, an adaptation of novels. Can you tell how you came about to promote it and decided to head that direction again, back into space?
I had not actually been familiar with the novels. I was coming off of many years of the police shows and CSI, and I had actually gotten interested in coming back to genre just because I loved it so much. And my agent brought me the pilot, which had been written by Mark Fergus and Hawk Ostby, who had written the original Iron Man movie and Children of Men, which is a wonderful movie. It was at that time at the Sci-Fi Channel, which had made some really bad shows for a very long period of time. I saw that it was at the Sci-Fi Channel, and I said, no, I'm not interested. They had, like, the last good thing they had done was Battlestar Galactica, and that was like years and years ago. But my agent said, no, take a look at the script. And I finally read it because I love Children of Men, because I thought it was a wonderful movie. And I was like, wow, okay, this is really different, because what it was for the first time, I felt like it was something that was trying to make space a character. It was like the hostility of the environment, the actual physics of the environment, the fact that rockets only apply thrust in one direction. It's like you can't
no inertial dampers.
You can't back up. It had no tractor beams. It was nothing like that. And what it was this sort of really, interesting working class kind of a view of life in space in a solar system that had been colonized, but it had rules and it had limits, and those limits were like hard physical limits. So it was a way to sort of capture space in a science fiction show in a way that I had not really seen before, and I thought it had tremendous possibilities. So they were looking for a showrunner. That's what I do. I run shows, and so I came in and met with people, and we all hit it off, and and that was like 6 years ago almost at this point.
So it's been running. So one of the things that one notes, I mean, Cornell, we've worked very hard at expanding engineering. And one of the things that at Cornell now is 50% women in the freshman engineering class. I mean, I think a key on Expanse also is the diversity of characters and the diversity of people. How do those go together? I mean, I think that we've seen both of them kind of developing.
Well, the former, Cornell's, the makeup of the student body there, that is that's the world. I think that when I was undergraduate in A&EP, we had I think we had 40 people in our class, 2 of them were women. But similarly, the first writers' rooms that I went into in Hollywood, they were almost entirely men. And so that's something that has evolved. In terms of the books, that's really a credit to the authors. Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham, who are collectively James S.A. Corey, who's the author of the Expanse novels. They always said that, the colonization of the solar system, or the history of space flight going out, is not just going to be, corn-fed Nebraska boys. That's a relic of the 60s in the American space race. That the people who colonize space are going to be Chinese and Indian and Russian and Americans and everybody from all over the place, and everybody's going to mix. And so they brought that sensibility to the novels, and we've been very, very careful to bring that to the television show as well. As we cast that way, it's this mixture of races, ethnicities, colors, looks. And even the language itself, in that the people who live in the asteroid belt in the show use this weird polyglot of all sorts of different strains. And so it's a nice hallmark of the series, and that's really where it comes from.
There it goes. All right, so one of the things, go back, I mean, your career is an inspiration to a lot of Cornellians. I prompted this for you before. If you were to return to Cornell and you had the opportunity to teach a course to engineers, what would you teach to prepare them for the real world? And it may as much be, what would you tell them with your experiences?
I am not qualified to teach anything to engineers anymore, I fear, other than screenwriting, perhaps. But because God knows, it's like, I'm sure things that I learned are no longer even accurate. So it's like, dust off an old textbook one day and take a look at it, and you go, it's not really right anymore, is it?
But professional skills have become increasingly important. It's not only the technical side.
That's true. But when you talk about preparing for the real world, that is a moving target, because the real world changes quite quickly. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I would probably try to find some interesting connection between science and screenwriting, maybe even talk about those things in the context of history. I mean, one of the things we talked about early on in the first season of The Expanse was, and that is, the show is at a, at a fairly significant level, it's as much about economics and resource constraints and tribalism. It's got a lot of deep sort of historical themes in it. A book we talked about for season 1 is called The Guns of August, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning book about the first months of World War I, because that had a lot to do with sort of like, it had the same kind of structure. It was a series of events that nobody really wanted to have happen that led to this gigantic conflagration. And so I think there's probably an interesting course to be had between science fiction, sort of the sad cyclical nature of history sometimes, adaptations, and connections to technology. That's probably where I would go. That would be an interesting seminar, I think, maybe.
It would, and marries kind of the diversity of Cornell, the fact that it's not just engineering, but all of the arts and the components. All right, so I got just a couple more. You remember Cornell, so Ron Moore was an alumnus with you. Are you still engaged with friends and classmates?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Especially in these pandemic times, we've been doing, sort of, virtual drinks and cocktail hours occasionally with friends sort of all over the globe. Probably not as much as I would like, but yeah, and I've definitely kept in touch with certain people. I've kept in touch with, quite closely over the years.
That's great. All right, thank you, Naren. Let's switch to questions from the audience. So if you're good with that, I've got a stack sitting here. And we'll just start. The first one is from George Hartman. As a science consultant for a TV show, did you have to do research on astronomy, spaceflight, et cetera, to make sure that you were providing scientifically accurate advice? And how did you do this research?
Absolutely, we did. We would reach out to people. We had a lot of friends for Next Generation, people who worked at Caltech, people who worked sort of across the business, and we would pick up the phone and we would talk to people. I would do that. And then I would do my own research, obviously, on things as well. This was a little bit, Star Trek Next Generation ended in like 93, 94. So it was a little early on the internet research side of things. There was no Google, but it was, yeah. And we would get really mean reviews of the shows on Usenet. I mean, it was like that. That's what we would, that way back when. I mean, it was pretty hilarious. But yeah, there was a lot of outreach to people who actually knew what they were talking about. We did that also quite a bit on CSI. We had a dedicated research staff, and those guys would reach out to experts in all sorts of fields across the country to give us, to kind of keep us on the right track.
That's great. So let's say another one along some of the people in the shows that you work on in the science fiction in particular. Are there science enthusiasts among the staffs? Have you had interesting chats with them? I think you mentioned a little bit that you're having competitions and you're no longer winning all of the battles.
Oh, no, usually not. I mean, The Expanse, again, is kind of unique only because the authors themselves are so scientifically minded. Like Daniel Abraham has a background in biology. Ty is sort of has done a little bit of everything in his life, but has strong bent on physics and computers and technology. And those guys have spoke. They've been invited to Jeff Bezos' Mars conference, in Palm Springs, and to give talks about sort of the future of space exploration. So The Expanse is a little bit unique like that. Usually the enthusiasts we find for science are in fandom. We have been invited on The Expanse, we've been invited to tour Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin and do panels at these places. And I've been to SpaceX with For All Mankind. And, we work with NASA and astronauts. We've had astronauts come up from NASA to teach our actors how actually their bodies would move in 0G, so we can, so the actual physicality of it looks correct on screen. So, there's those guys are all out there. We've gone to Google and done talks. We've done it so I think there's that incredible connection between, science fiction and the fandom. It's one of those things that's inspired people to create things. And so we have the people who love science fiction are the ones who turn, fictional things into fact. And so I think it's nice, and I love being able to help that cycle continue.
I agree. So I'm going to equivalent in kind of the same vein. This is from one of your former students. Jennifer, you were a physics TA apparently.
I was.
So Naren, thanks for doing this webinar. As one of your former students when you were a physics class TA, I've been very proud to be one of the technical experts that contributed anonymously to a CSI killing. And it gave me something in common with Taylor Swift, season 9, episode 16. I don't know how this.
Okay, wow.
You're assumed that you must know all of these, but I think.
Oh my God.
But the question continues. With our current societal situation, with less respect and trust in scientific results and presentations, do you see part of your efforts in helping to restore some of that?
I certainly feel like that is part of the mission actually these days. And I'm a huge backer of organizations like the Union of Concerned Scientists, and anything that gets out scientific method analysis, testing of facts, data-driven decision making. I'm 100% behind. I do think it's a real problem these days. I mean, it feels like the country didn't used to be about what the facts are. It was a question about what policy should we enact because of the facts. And that is, disputing gravity is not going to get you to the moon. It is not going to get you to the moon.
Yeah.
Right.
So we got to do it. All right. So here's from another fellow. As a fellow physics grad from Cornell, I love geeking out and appreciating a lot of the physics science touches in The Expanse. But there are a lot of things that come up that I'd never thought through that make me go, huh? I never thought of that. That's so cool. I'm curious about whether you experienced that while working on the show, and if there are any such examples in particular that come to mind.
Well, there are a bunch. I mean, when you start really talking about how things move in space, all sorts of crazy things can happen. I mean, we have, I can't really go into too many details because it's season 5 stuff, and season 5 has not aired yet. but there's a very, very complex orbital, essentially, classical dynamics problem with 2 ships trying to dock with one another, and one ship is essentially in a spiral. And how the ship gets into the spiral, and the actual physical path of it, which I think we didn't exactly quite nail 100%, but we have conversations on The Expanse about conservation of angular momentum, and that is not something that you normally do on most television shows. But yeah, we do pay attention to it. We even had this moment where it actually never made the cut, but we did shoot it. We were talking about how we have these ships that are moving around the solar system at quite high speeds, and so the clock synchronization comes into play. So we had a moment where the Rocinante, the ship, the hero ship in the show, docks at a space station. And when it docks, you see on a screen that there's a time synchronization. Is that because the Rossi's clock, because the ship has been moving so fast relative to the station, we actually correct the relativistic time delay and sync up the clocks. That is hardcore geek stuff. But we actually put it into the show. The shot just didn't work, so it didn't make the cut. But literally, the conversation, like the look on the director's face, we were telling him what this was because we were all excited. The director was just like,
"What is this?" No
one cared.
Yeah, okay. The fans do.
It's a nice touch because it
is.
It highlighted an actual problem.
It initially comes.
Yeah.
All right, let me switch a few of the questions to ones that are asking about careers. So kind of for an aspiring writer director, what advice would you give them to break into the industry?
Well, I mean, it's going to sound trite, but it's like, I would say write and direct. I mean, you know, right now, I think more so than any time, the ability to actually get your work out there is, it's incredibly easy compared to what it used to be. You used to have to literally get yourself to Los Angeles, get to know people, get in the industry, try to get people to read your script. I mean, like it was the need to be in LA to be in this business was absolutely critical. I don't think it's that way now. It is obviously, there's tremendous concentrations of talent here, and organizations and studios and all sorts of people around the business. That's not going to change anytime soon. But just the ability and the tools that people have, you know, Steven Soderbergh has done 2 features shot on iPhones. That tells you something about what the state of the technology is. And that is the ability to do that, the ability to have a voice as a filmmaker, to go out there and put something that, you know, into the world that you've made at a very, very high technical level has never been greater. And I think that's part of the reason you see so many interesting new voices coming into the business right now.
And there's so many platforms, I mean, Amazon
Absolutely.
and Apple TV and
absolutely
is trying to find it. So what along the same, did you ever have any doubts or second thoughts about leaving engineering? Have you wanted to go back and be a real engineer?
You know, I think my parents certainly wanted me to go back and they thought I would get it out of my system and then come back to something sensible. They didn't understand what this business was. Neither did I. I think the short answer to that question is no, because I think at some level I knew that I don't think I would have been a very good engineer. And by that I don't mean I don't think I'm a dummy, but I think that my skill set and personality would not have been conducive to success in that field, because I'm kind of impatient. I like things to happen a little quickly. And I have, you know, my interests don't drive into, like, you know, I don't always go into the weeds and the nuts and the bolts of things. I'm more of a generalist and less of a specialist. And I think that, especially when you go into doctoral studies, you become more and more of a specialist on a smaller and smaller corner of the universe. And that is I don't think I wanted that personally for myself. And so this just falling stupidly into this career the way I did, it turns out, and this is actually television, not even features, because like you can spend 3 years writing a feature and another 2 years getting it made. And that's just one thing. You know, the pace of television I find really invigorating and stimulating, is that you can be in a room with a lot of people, you can develop a lot of stories, you can make them, you can go on to another project that's completely different about something completely different. I find that incredibly intellectually stimulating. And so, you know, this business that I've ended up in, that's this odd combination of you know, purely creative writing, filmmaking, storytelling, but also managerial, technical, you know, the shooting of it, because film is actually an incredibly technical medium in terms of how you make it and how you make it look in a particular way. And then post-production, the visual effects side of things, the sound, the color design, it's like all of these things like appeal to sort of like broad areas of my own skill set. So I sort of feel like I wound up in a really perfect job for who I am and what I find interesting.
I mean, the background and the experiences give you things. All right, now I have to ask my own question. You actually mentioned film as a media. You don't actually still shoot on film, do you?
Some people do. It's become more of an art thing to do. I mean, J.J. Abrams does. Christopher Nolan still shoots on film. In fact, Kodak makes film just for them. I think Spielberg does it still. the vast majority of people, I mean, the cameras and the abilities to do things with them are so much greater in digital. I mean, I directed an episode of CSI in like 2010. We were still shooting film then, but that's about the end of it. I don't think there's a single television show anymore that uses film. CSI might have been the last, actually.
Okay. I loved it, Bigo. All right,
Yeah.
so in the same career, so here's one from Deborah. As a camera operator in New York, coming from Cornell Engineering, Ori. In 25 years, I've only really met the McConkie brothers who are in production, who went to Cornell, and they weren't engineers undergrad. I'm kind of surprised given the radical technical transformations that have occurred. Am I missing something, or are Cornell's engineers missing an opportunity to be technically involved in the industry? Uh-oh, did I freeze, or did Naren freeze?
Looks like Naren is frozen, Mike.
Okay.
Let's give him a moment to get back on.
There we go, now he's back.
Am I back? Okay, yeah, sorry, I could hear your voice, but could you repeat the question?
So it was kind of the only people that she's met are the McConkie brothers in production who went to Cornell as undergraduates, and wondering whether there's an opportunity for engineers on the technical side as well in the industry. And she says to say hi to Gary Moeller, I guess a key on CSI.
Oh, Gary. Okay, cool. I will.
He trained
Gary's
me.
Great.
She says he trained me, and I have stories to use if you need them.
Wait, what's your name? Hold on, I got to write that down.
Christy will send that to you in
Okay, please. Okay, good. Yeah. No, I was just talking to Gary this morning. Gary's awesome. I don't know about missing out. I think there's certain companies that get involved, technically in the business, and it's so technologically driven. I mean, like one of the things, on The Expanse is we get, and it's shot in Toronto. So our DPs have a lot of ties to, various companies in the business, and especially businesses in Eastern Canada. But we get, first crack at image sensors and stabilization rigs and all sorts of things that are highly technologically driven. So it just depends on if you can find your way to those companies that are interested in this stuff. That's, I think, the path into the business. I don't, there's so many companies that make an interesting technology, and film tends to be, and television tends to be bleeding edge. It's like you're taking like the latest stuff because it gives you the ability to do things in a way that people haven't used them before. And so, I mean, like back when we started The Expanse, the guy who directed the pilot, Terry McDonough, and our cinematographer, Jeremy Benning, they developed a stabilization rig for the camera that we were using that hadn't really been built that way before. Nobody'd ever really used it in a television production before. And we did it simply because we were building sets that were essentially completely enclosed. So the camera had to be inside it. And so you couldn't open up a wall really and shoot within it, because we wanted the sense of being enclosed in the spaceship. In other words, you're shooting 360 degrees all the time. So we built a camera rig that could move around fluidly in 3 different axes, and it actually created, helped really sell this idea of movement in zero gravity. And so that lent itself to the show very, very, very well. And that's part of the fun of it. You get to indulge in the latest toys and technologies. And on the computer side with visual effects, it's just like, year after year, it's like the advances in it are incredible. I mean, we have stuff in season 5 where we use animated digital doubles seamlessly with actual live physical actors. And it's enabled us to do things and portray people moving in space in a way that we've never been able to do it before. So, and that's something that changes year by year.
So here's what kind of goes with it. I have to admit, I should have thought of it as well. The question is, what does a showrunner do? And I think that kind of says you get to play with everything.
Well, the showrunner is kind of the best way to really understand it is it's kind of like being the CEO of like a 150 or 200 person startup. Basically, is that my job is I am the creative director of the show. I sit with the writers, we develop the stories, I write tons of scripts, I rewrite almost all of the scripts at some point or another. But it is a creative vision, but then it is a managerial vision because I'm the last word in the production. I get approval essentially on everything. And so the ability to sort of have a purely psychological, a purely creative side basis. I'm sorry, I'm getting some noise in the back here. Give me 1 second. I'm getting junk faxes. Sorry. For some reason, I should unplug that goddamn thing. I have that hooked up. But the showrunner is involved in supervising the production, working with the actors. On the post-production side, I'm the one who approves and delivers all the cuts. It's like the director will give me a cut and then I will do a cut on it and that goes to the network. And I literally approve like every visual effects shot, color the show, supervise the sound design, finished product. So it is literally beginning to end. And that's kind of what the showrunner does.
you of course get no sleep.
It is you stay busy, but if you have the right personality, it's really a fun job.
Okay. So there's one that kind of goes with this. Showrunner has to deal with insecurities and egos and a gazillion moving parts, kind of like national politics. Would it be good for showrunners to become government runners?
You know what? I'll tell you, I don't think so, because the business, the entertainment business is, and production companies in particular are hierarchical. They would be great if your model of government is dictatorship, because that's effectively what they are. It's like, it's not about consensus building. It's not really about like developing legislation that everybody can agree on. It's like, you have one person who's really in charge of the finished product, and everybody else is like the departmental and organizational structure of film productions enables them to move very quickly, because you have very highly empowered department heads who are specifically responsible for a tiny fraction of the process, and very few people are responsible for the entire product. And so that's kind of what enables it to happen. So again, it's like it can be autocratic. I don't run my shows that way. There are people who do, but it is. I don't know if you'd want to get like crazy showrunners in charge of the government. I think it might be bad.
So on a more serious one, going back, when writing futuristic fiction, what present day issues do you see as truly and deeply shaping the future?
Well, climate change is the first thing that comes to mind. It's it's in the background of The Expanse. It's like, the show portrays the Earth and the cities on the moon as a united state, essentially, under the United Nations. And the authors of the books will say, well, what made that happen is a massive climate crisis that required global action. And it required countries to give up a certain level of sovereignty to deal with it on a planetary basis. It's not something that we talk about on the show, but it's there in the background of the show, is that it required collective action on a planetary scale and global scale to deal with that particular issue. And that is the one, honestly, that comes to mind, because it's hugely impactful in every way.
I have another question from a former colleague of yours, John, who claims he was an old roommate, and says that he also gave up engineering, is now an MD.
John Elliott.
Okay, you said his name. I didn't want to. But he asked,
how are you, buddy?
How has COVID changed your shooting and planning? I was going to avoid COVID, but it's a good question.
No, it's a good question. It's really, we're figuring it out right now because productions are coming back, largely in Canada at this point, to a much lesser extent in Los Angeles. But all of the guilds, the Directors Guild, the Screen Actors Guild, have put together processes to actually deal with this at a production level, in terms of there's a zone system in which like certain people can go here but not here. You have badges and color coding, and it's going to be a big change, and we're actually factoring these elements into our budgets at this point, because this is a brand new thing. Film crews traditionally in sets, everybody's elbow to elbow and they're jam-packed most of the time. Those days, at least for the present, are gone. You can't really shoot that way. And so it is testing regimes. It is essentially, bunkering, actors, crew, certain elements of the production, limiting flow. But there is a tremendous amount of work being done in that regard. People are still figuring it out. I think, maybe 3, 4, 5 months from now, I think people get a little bit more used to it. It's all very new. It's making things slower. It is definitely a cost issue that we're all dealing with, but it's a safety issue, so everybody's dealing with it.
Okay, that's good. I mean, and thought how challenging it would be for living all. So another one, kind of on technical side, Cornell has had a huge impact on computer graphics. Do you ever see that in your interactions with the CGI on the shows? Or is that all maybe far enough away that you don't see who does what in the CGI?
No, I spend a lot of time with the visual effects artists and the companies. We use about nine different vendors in Toronto, and so it's a big complex pipeline of stuff, and it's hugely fascinating. But yes, I do remember way back when I actually had friends, and I did some work in the what was then called the Computer Aided Design Instructional Facility, way back when, and they were some of the very early. This was like, I think this was before even RenderMan actually came out. So it was like the very, very early stuff. I did, the highlight of that particular time in my career was Steve Jobs at Next had come to Cornell to give a talk, and he had donated 10 of the original Next cubes to Cornell. And I was working with a guy, I was working on my doctoral thesis, and we ported over some ray tracing work that we had done to model the lens system from DEC, VAX VMS, to the Next machine in Interface Builder. And I got to actually demo that to Steve Jobs in the facility. So that was kind of a super cool moment for me.
That is, that's another name there. Yeah. So I'm going to just some comments. One is, says, John, you are a real engineer and we do everything without limit. Thank you for expanding the opportunities for our engineering and science graduates. I think that's great. Cool. Here's one, I think you will answer it, but from Danielle, if you had been offered both a science job post-PhD and the Hollywood opportunity, which would you have taken? Do you miss the academia?
Okay, that's actually a good question. It has a very easy answer. Is I actually got, and this was on the basis of a recommendation from somebody at CADIF, that I came very close to getting a job at Apple Computer. And this was Apple in the 90s. And they flew me out there. It went down to me and another person. I think I was going to be the engineering software evangelist, was the position. And I didn't get the job. And that was the one job I really would have taken. It really would have sucked to be in Silicon Valley in the 90s. That would have been terrible. But after I didn't get that job, that was the next decision was, okay, I'm going to go out and I'll do this other thing and see how that plays. So that is the job I would have taken.
All right, and from one more of your fans, this is from Mark Walter. Hi, Naren. Good to see a fellow pledge.
Mark Walter, this is one of my old Kappa Alpha chums.
Thanks for participating in this social media session. I noticed that you were an active participant in CSI blogs with fans. How has interaction on fan social media influenced show production?
You know, it's for different people have different answers to that. I personally am not a fan of social media. I don't have a Facebook account. I have a Twitter. I have a Twitter account, but I only really use that to deal with sort of promotional elements for The Expanse and shows. I think part of the problem for me is you can't tell a story by consensus. It requires somebody to take an attack on an idea and a theme. If you're trying to listen to everybody telling you what to do, if you ask 100 people what they should do with a story, you'll get 100 different answers. And so it's like that kind of interaction with the fans doesn't interest me. In terms of engaging with fans, that's a different thing. Like on the first 3 seasons of The Expanse, when we were on Sci-Fi, every episode of the show, we would get together as a group, staff, actors, and we would live tweet the show. So as it played on the air, we would interact with the fans, and that was fun, you know. And I think that what that has become is that's become a replacement for, you know, the fact that, you know, everybody was watching the same things at the same time. You know, you don't have 4 channels anymore. But now, if you have a social engagement element to watching a show, then people who love to talk about the show can all talk about the show together. And so I think that that's something that is kind of replaced, has come into fashion, because I think people have a need and a desire to want to talk about these things if they love something. And so that certainly has made that possible. So in that sense, I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, the water cooler when we had 3 networks and
much easier and a much simpler conversation. Yeah, because everybody watched the same thing.
Everybody had the same experience.
Yeah.
So here's a great one for you. What's next on your bucket list, so to speak?
Oh my God, bucket list. Jesus, do you know something? I think this is actually, you know, I don't have a bucket list. I really don't, because I think I got very, very lucky to be able to do a career which I absolutely find delightful and absorbing. And the joy of it is doing new projects, jumping into a new season of a show, continuing telling stories at a really interesting high level technically in the business. I think the ability right now to do what you call novelistic television has never been greater. That's why TV lends itself to novels, is that you can tell a movie. And, you know, right now we're at about 56 episodes of The Expanse. We're telling a 56-hour movie, you know, and that is an amazing way to look at these things. These are tightly arced stories. They're meaningful in the long term. We're not just doing an episode of Crime of the Week like CSI. That's a much older kind of a model for storytelling. And this is unique. This is something you can't capture in a 2-hour feature. It's like, you know, you think about like an amazing show like Chernobyl on HBO. That was a 5-hour limited series, right? You couldn't really tell that in the theater, and it was incredible. So the ability to be able to do that kind of story at the level that you can actually put it on the screen and actually have the time to tell it the way it needs to be done is phenomenal. I've never been in a more interesting time in the history of television.
I think there's the transition to story arcs rather than episodes. Episodic behavior has just been an enormous change in the genre and behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it kind of goes. There's a question here: will the recording be made available? And I think the answer is going to be yes. And I think the last question I'll ask you is, what's your future? VR. Do you see VR entering the 3D? Are you gonna?
3D has sort of become like one of those things that's sort of dropped out of fashion. It's not, I don't know, it doesn't seem to bring a great deal to the party. You know, VR, in what sense are you using it? I
mean, so we're still immersive experiences for the audience would be kind of, I suspect, what they're asking.
Well, I mean, I think it kind of comes back to um, you're asking, I think, fundamental questions about storytelling, which the business is still grappling with, because you could make the argument that any number of really interesting, video games like Red Dead Redemption or The Last of Us or any of these things are telling stories. They're experiential, but they're telling stories in sort of a looser sense. But the idea of a narrative is not exactly that. It's like, I think those games are closer to like, developing sort of like delivering a life experience,
Yeah.
right? It's like, and I still feel like that it's distinct from a novelistic experience in which you are limiting perspective specifically for a point. You're trying to convey an idea or an emotion or a concept that forces you to restrict the audience's perspective. That's part of what storytelling is what to show or what not to show. And so when you start getting into like purely experiential places like VR, like let people explore, it's not impossible to tell a story, but you're not telling a story in quite the same way. And so I think that's an issue that, that people are struggling with. Right now it seems to be that there are augmented reality elements that are attached to shows that are like ancillary information and allow you to sort of drill deeper into certain aspects of things. I think people are still searching. I mean, maybe there's some really, really genius individual out there somewhere who's gonna crack the code of this in a new form of storytelling is gonna emerge. That's certainly possible. I do feel like there's something really hardwired into our biology about how people tell stories and absorb them, because they become ways for you to sort of comprehend the world, and so sometimes restriction of narrative is actually extremely important for that.
So my final question is, when COVID's over, how are we going to get you back on campus for a visit?
I love coming back. My mom still lives in upstate New York. We shoot The Expanse shoots in Toronto, so it's not that tough to do. It's just mostly a question of time. I love coming back to Cornell. I just haven't done it nearly as much as I should.
So we'll have to definitely invite you. So I want to very much thank you for your time, Naren. This has been wonderful. And
it's my pleasure.
And thank all of the audience, those that have been on. The answer is in the chat that the recording will be available. And I think this has been a wonderful time. So we'll end the webinar now. And thank you again. I'll clap for the entire audience. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you guys. All right.
Now we see.